Welcome back to the Holosky Podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Steven.
And Kyle.
And it is 2024. Happy New Year, Holocult. Let's kickstart this week and year off right. I want to take time to wish my youngest boy, Maddox, a happy 14th birthday.
Hey.
We're recording this on the 30th, so it is his birthday today. If he tunes in, I hope it's an awesome one. Hope you get everything you wanted. I know he was flashing all his birthday cash around here this last week, so he's having a good time. We are jumping back into part 2 of Project Preserve Destiny. If you have not checked out the first one, make sure you go back to last week's episode and check it out. That way you're not lost as to where we are. It's about to get crazy because, yeah, Kyle was sending me little like snippets of research he was doing. I'm like, what is even happening?
Yeah, it's a little weird. It's definitely weird.
Before we do that, we got to get through the business. So check us out at all our social medias, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, Discord, Reddit. Search up the Holosky Podcast and join the Holocult because that's what everybody does. It's a good thing to do.
That's what you're supposed to do.
This is our Monday show. Tomorrow, our audio from the night shift usually drops. And Thursday, we have our listener experience show. So if you have a listener experience you'd like to submit for a future show on Thursdays, Kyle found some very strange fey scrawlings on the outside of his house that has some information that you're going to want.
That I did. That information is, if you want to send us any of your experiences, you can do so by sending that to the email, which is holoskypodcast@gmail.com. Or you can record yourself on them fancy little devices in your hand. Shoot that over to the email. Either way, we'll be able to get it, then talk about it on the show. If you want to call or text the holophone, it's going to be 618-556-0837. You can do that at your leisure. It takes a minute to get back to you normally, but yeah, the email is probably the most preferred way of doing it. It's just easier for me and Steve to keep it in order. We can flag it and all that jazz.
If you'd like to support the show, plenty of ways you can do it. We have a Patreon. You can go over there and check that out, where we release extra content and some other stuff. It's pretty cool. Go check it if that's what you're into. We have a store where you can go and look for some Holosky merch and rep the Holocult. We have a Venmo if you'd like to throw some pocket change in there. We greatly appreciate it. The best thing you can do, word of mouth. Share the show. Share the show. Share the show. Social media, repost the show. I know I got a guy on Twitter that reposts every show, every single show. I'm gonna have to look.
That's awesome,
dude. I'm gonna have to look up his name.
Just going hard in the paint.
It's awesome. Every show that drops, he reposts it.
That's what we need. That way we can do this full time.
Yep.
And really get into the weird, because I've got some cool ideas that we need extra time to pull off.
Shout out to our Twitter friend. Canucks will never win a cup because homie reposts everything that comes out.
Much love,
Big
brother.
Ups. Big
Much
ups.
love.
You can also go to wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a 5-star rating and review, and I will find them and shout them out if I can. That being said, today's 5-star rating and review is brought to us all by our friend Pataka1328. 5 stars, one of the best. Can't wait to listen to your shows. You guys always deliver. Thank you. Pataka1328, thank you for not only being a listener and a supporter and a member of the Holocult, but also taking the time to leave us this 5-star rating and review. Much appreciated.
Much love.
From there, we are diving into part 2 of Project Preserve Destiny. Again, if you have not listened to the first one, rewind back to last week's episode. Peep that before you peep this.
Yeah, you're definitely going to want to do that. In doing this episode, it's very forward. The way he writes it, like he just lays out everything that he did. There's really, like, a lot of the questions that you would have do get answered by the way that he writes this, but we kind of left off with him being in class and whatnot, so we're going to pick back up to, like, after the first day of him trying to move this sin wave that he had on his screen, and he couldn't do it then. And he felt so defeated, which I feel like anybody would do in that circumstance, because I don't feel like it's a very logical / easy task.
And they've already kind of built him up. Like, we know you have this ability.
Yeah, you're this special dude.
Yeah.
So he's kind of failing at these tasks, and he's starting to question if it's even possible to do, which I feel like anyone would do, because you would just logically be like, this is impossible. I can't do this. But he sits there, huh?
Easy to get discouraged.
Oh, absolutely. He sits there for 3 days straight, 3 to 4 hours at a time, trying to move this damn line. And what makes it even more frustrating is that the headphones that he's wearing are there to communicate with his instructor. One way. His instructor can just tell him stuff. Anything that he wants to know, he has to type out on the screen. But the instructor's not doing shit. Not giving him any help at all whatsoever. So Dan's even more frustrated. But at a certain point, he does actually get the line to move. And then the instructor's like, all right, now I'm going to start helping you. Which you got to realize is going to be frustrating as fuck. Only until you have this little amount of success does the instructor's like, all right, now I'm going to do my job.
Yeah. Frustrating is an understatement.
Right. But it also, by him doing this, it does confirm that it is possible to do. So it kind of puts a little bit of pep in his step, so to speak. And as soon as the line, like the second the line move, the instructor begins to kind of help, which does help Dan move forward in a little bit larger strides than without, his aid. At the end of the day, Dan is kind of like, you know what? I might actually be a big deal because I got this thing to move. He was able to tap in and essentially use a superpower that aliens implanted in him. So wrap your brain around that one. But Dan was super excited and he wanted to gloat, but he couldn't because he's not allowed to talk to anybody about anything. It's not to say that he didn't contemplate doing this, but he thinks to himself, even if I do gloat about this to people, they're not going to believe me. Furthermore, it'll probably change my relationship with that person because they're just going to think that I'm crazy, which kind of, it hits home because that's literally how everyone who's had a paranormal experience or something unexplained happen to them feel.
Yep.
So it's extremely relatable in the way that he feels. Regardless, dude, he started crushing these Synwave classes. He went through, like, a day or two after he starts to fluctuate the line, he starts crushing through like 10 different tones in a day or two, and he's killing it, just feeling fucking great. Until he was given 2 lines to manipulate at the same time. This one, once again, and like he hits this brick wall where he's like, all right, I'm done. I can't fucking do this. So it's almost like he has this mental battle of success and failure that hit him crazy hard while he's doing this. But his instructor tells him to visualize 2 points in space. Each would represent 2 different tones. He was to force the 2 points together, creating 1 point in space. The instructor told Dan that these points would resist each other like magnets. In a weird context here, the instructor says you need to visualize yourself sapping the energy from each point. That way, they won't be able to force themselves apart. Which is a pretty crazy way to visualize the entire thing. I feel like I can't put it into context, but I feel like it has relevance to other things in the paranormal. Because you think of the way ghosts, quote unquote, will zap the energy from batteries to help manifest things.
Yeah.
Like I feel like that's relevant in the grand scheme of the paranormal world.
And there's so much to unpack with like that general statement, like them trying to take 2 points in space and merge them together is almost like, faster than light travel.
Yeah, it has like a wormhole effect. Yeah, that I didn't think about it like that, but like it definitely
really
does.
Testing out what he's capable of.
Oh, dude, it gets crazier. But as you can imagine, for someone who is not versed in this, once again, like that thought process, the whole thing almost breaks him. He said it was so hard to do this, almost like his mind was lifting weights the entire time he's attempting to do this. But he was able to do this. And then from that point on, it was like he was off to the races, man. So they threw 3 lines at him. It was difficult, but his progress was progress. So it kept that train moving. So he tanked it, got it, boom, got this. And then they started throwing more and more and more lines at him. He goes 4 lines, nails it. From here, I'll include this little bit because it just goes to show how the human mind operates around these types of situations. One day on his way to class, and it does actually, believe it or not, this does become kind of semi-relevant later on in the story, which I didn't find out at the time until obviously later on. But so he's going through all these secret ass classes, right? He's got his day classes that he's doing, and then he's doing these night classes where he's learning to talk with fucking aliens.
That's so wild.
It is wild. Well, one day his class gets out, or no, he's going into his class. So he's getting out of that van that I told about in the first episode, and Dan notices a new light source, essentially, because he's in this very confined environment. Like everything is the same all the time, but he notices his new light source, and he's curious. He's like, "Where the hell is this light coming from?" So instead of walking directly into the building, he decides to walk behind the van that he gets delivered in. No sooner he gets behind that van, and as he starts to break around the back of the van, his driver honks at him. It's like, "Hey, get your ass where you're supposed to be going." And he, being in the military and whatnot, he does. He instantly stops, turns around, and starts to walk back. But not before he sneaks a peek around the edge of that van. And what he sees another van, an all-white van, parked next to his van. And so he's super curious about it. He's like, why is there this break in protocol? What's going on?
I was curious if they were the further he got in the test, if they gave him more freedom, because they were just kind of ushering him right into the door.
No, they do not give him any any leeway at all. They're keeping him tightly confined. But so he goes back inside, and at this point, he's kind of he's worried, and Dan seems to be a really, I don't know how to word this. He's a person that follows protocol, but he has this curiosity about him that can sometimes get the better of him. His mind plays the whole angel and devil on your shoulder constantly.
Yeah.
But when he gets back inside after seeing this van, he thinks to himself, he's like, "Fuck. Did I just see something that I wasn't supposed to? Am I going to get in trouble? Is the captain going to grill me for this?" Ironically enough, none of that ends up happening when he sees the captain. So his brain goes further down the rabbit hole. Well, maybe it wasn't a big deal that I saw this van, and that's why the captain didn't say anything. Or, now that I think about it, is the captain downplaying it to trick me into thinking that it wasn't a big deal, even though it was a big deal.
Was it a test?
Right. So that is so relatable. Like when we were dealing with egress and all that other shit, like how your brain will concoct these scenarios and they just feed down the larger rabbit hole.
Yep. Was it a test? Did they put that there to see if I was going to break protocol and,
Exactly. Like your brain will just fabricate all of these scenarios. And it's so hard. And that's what makes finding the truth sometimes so difficult, because your brain will fabricate these scenarios. Some of them might be right. Some of them are going to be so far away from where you need to be that it hurts you more than helps you.
It's your own worst enemy most times.
100%, man. Well, so back to kind of the normality of the story here. For a while after the white van event, Dan would often look for it. It doesn't really show up anytime soon, so it fades from his thoughts, and he just gets back to business as usual. But one would conclude that, Dan kind of like rationalizes the van, and the end of it, he's like, it was mostly, it's probably just a maintenance van or something stupid like that, right? And so he lets it go. Months go by, or however long goes by. I shouldn't say months because I'm not exactly sure. But time goes by. He forgets about it. Back to training, turning into Rocky, mental Rocky. And then one night he's driving home from like the movies or something. And he's exiting off the road. And he just happens to look at his rearview mirror, and he sees a white van behind him. And he perks up. He's like, oh, shit. No way. Like, no way is this the same white van. So he's in the right lane to exit, and the van kind of moves to the left lane and starts to pass him. So Dan slows down enough to let this van pass. And when it does, Dan goes, holy shit. It's the same white van, because the white van that he caught a glimpse of earlier had a very particular dent in the bumper. And he sees the exact same dent. So he's like, shit, this is the same van. So going way off reservation here, Dan click, hits that left blinker, gets back over and starts following this white van. And and that's what I mean, like his brain is very interesting, because he likes curiosity. He wants answers. He wants to follow it. But his brain is doing this massive back and forth. Like, I've got to follow this guy. I've got to get answers. But am I doing something that's going to get me killed? Am I going to get in shitloads of trouble? Should I be doing this? But he just says, fuck it. I'm doing it. I'm following this thing. So he follows the van. They go into this neighboring small town, and the van pulls into a business, and Dan just kind of like drives by to try not to draw any attention to him. Well, Dan ends up busting a UE down the road a little ways and comes back and sees that the van comes from a business in noise cancellation, which kind of threw Dan for a loop. And it kind of left him like, I feel like it brought subtle closure for that moment where he's like, oh, this is just some dude noise cancellation. Like, it's not that big of a deal, right? But he figured most likely it had something to do with the headphones that he was wearing during class. So he's like, whatever. No big deal, it is what it is. I overthought it. It's just some dude doing his job, most likely. So as time went on, his lessons were more and more complex. However, because of all this training, it as training should, it makes each upcoming lesson that much easier. He could comprehend the assignment a lot better at this point, which led to much faster success rates. During this time, his teacher became more and more vocal. He also informed Dan that he would be stationed at different bases throughout his course in the PPD program. When Dan would go to these new bases, he would have a password that would allow him to access this terminal to record his conversations. And Dan's password for most of it, / I'm assuming call sign, would be staunch-118. This would give him access to each, like I said, terminal at the corresponding base. This process became so complex that Dan would actually watch videos and report on what he was seeing. So at this point, he's pretty much mastered the whole process of the IC program. Like he's just like at the pinnacle of it and living on cloud 9 essentially. Like he's thinking, I am the man at this point. Right? And it's kind of cool because in the book, at this point, he actually posts pictures. Because remember, if you remember from the first episode, they mask all of these trainings with other trainings. So essentially, by the time Dan was done with PPD, he was also done with his ELINT classes. And it's cool because Dan posts a picture of himself. He posts the certificate of completion of the ELINT classes. He had pictures of the facility and like a big array from where he was at. So it's kind of cool and did give some credence to at least a section of his story. He also notes how during his entire military career, and he ends up finding it weird later on now that all this is unfolded, but he's like, I find it weird that everything in my military career just kind of worked for me. Like, and we're the same way at our jobs. Like if there's a job opening and you're like, I'm putting in for this job, I deserve this job. If I don't get this fucking job, I quit. And Dan apparently did that quite a bit throughout his military career. Each time he would end up getting that position. Like anything that he wanted, if he expressed the people around him, like, if I don't get this, I'm just, after my shit comes up, I'm out. I'm leaving. It would always go through for him. He would always get the job that he wanted, get stationed where he wanted, the whole nine. So as you can imagine, later on, as this unfolded, he kind of came to this conclusion, like, they have been watching me and guiding me through, like, getting me ready for this moment, not letting me leave the military.
Yeah. Making sure it's as easy as possible.
Exactly.
Scooting him right through.
So after Dan has pretty much whipped ass at the PPD classes, the IC classes, whatever you want to call them, he finally gets sent to his first assignment. It's kind of cool being like, I'm into this type of stuff. So it's this whole very like cloak and dagger style shit, because Captain White, who's his original contact for the project, informed Dan before he left Maryland that only people the only people he can talk with about the project were people that Captain White himself introduces. No one else at all, period, the end, can have a conversation about the project. So at his new base, he gets there and he's hanging out, waiting for his credentials to come through. He's been there for about a month or so. And with the type of work that he's in, without his clearances, he basically can't do anything. So he's just kind of sitting around twiddling his thumbs, waiting for the clearances. He finally gets a call from Captain White, informing him that a person from his unit would be in contact with him on this very phone after they end their conversation. Sure enough, 30 minutes later, after the captain had hung up, a man called and told him when and where to meet. He says, and I quote, "I'll be at the gate with my arms crossed waiting for you." The man waiting for Dan at the fence was a Captain Stanley. He was the site operations officer at this base. And it gets a little more complex for Dan at this point. He introduces another team member to Dan. So try to visualize what I'm saying here, because it does get a little complex. But so you have this new captain, Captain Stanley, and Dan. And he introduces another team member, which will be working with Dan on the normal assignment. So can't talk to this guy about the project. But he says these two will be working in a van together. During this time, Dan will actually be communicating with the aliens and dealing with that while keeping it hidden from homie. Like, the way they describe these vans is fucking crazy. It's essentially like a big box. You know what? I'll wait. I'll get into the dimensions and shit in just a minute. But anyways, after this guy left, Dan's talking to Stanley, and he brings up the word alien to Captain Stanley, and the captain's like, "Hey, never use that word ever. Just don't. The only thing that you can use is refer to it as gray. Do not use alien. Don't use anything else. Just gray."
That's strange.
It is strange, but it also makes sense for people listening. And gray could be just a cover word, or
yeah, but
you know what I mean.
Yeah, and if you wrap it around into what's going on today, like anytime the government starts to talk about this thing, they've strayed so far away from the term extraterrestrial or alien.
Yeah.
Everything's non-human intelligence, which is
bro, it is weird, because there is a lot of information in here that I do feel like pertains to today's bullshit. It's weird. But once again, you hear it all the time, man, and it drives me fucking crazy how people would be like, well, it would take so many people to deal with this cover up. It's just impossible. Okay, listen to this. This is how fucking nuts security is at this location. So to this van, there was a cipher lock on the door. Now, the second the doors were open, you'd have to go through, enter the 5-digit code on the cipher lock, hurry up and get inside, because you only have X amount of time to get inside before an alarm goes off. Then, after that door is completely shut, the second door is like a fucking bank vault door. He literally describes it like a bank vault. It's got the combination lock on it, the big handle that retracts the bars, the whole nine. I mean, it's crazy. Another thing that I think is fucking nuts is Dan also notices, I guess this isn't in the van. This must be in the facility, so I apologize for that. I got a little mixed up here. But Dan notices a paper shredder, and it's a big one, right? Apparently, every single piece of paper on site gets shredded. Everything. They even point out simple things like if something classified just happened to be written on the side of a newspaper, or if the ink imprint from a classified document somehow transferred to another piece of paper. So they're preparing for shit that logically is not going to happen. It is the security on paper and stuff is so fucking tight that one day Dan was using a hole punch and emptied the paper, the little circles, into a normal trash can and took it outside of the dumpster and dumped it. He comes back inside, and his supervisor goes, "What'd you just go do?" And Dan's like, he was getting ready to tell him, and then goes, "Oh, shit. I just dumped the paper from this hole punch in the dumpster or the whatever outside." And the supervisor goes, "Go out there, find every single dot, and bring him back." So Dan said he literally was out there for over 2 hours with the trash emptied out, and he had tape inside out on his hands, picking up all of these little punch dots.
That's terrifying and crazy.
That's what I'm saying. But these are the small little, and that's just for paper in the normal facility.
Yeah.
That's not going into these crazy projects and the security measures they take for that.
Yeah, I mean, they say that's why they keep the good stuff on pen and paper, because A, it's easy to destroy,
right?
And it stays on pen and paper. Once it goes digitally, all it takes is one link in the chain to break, and then it's put out to the world.
Exactly.
Then you got to put out a giant fire.
Yep. And now I'll go back to the vans that he's going to be working in with this coworker of his. So the vans, apparently they're not actually vans. They're just called C vans, communication vans. They're basically a metal box to work on communications from. I would assume they have actual vans too, but I don't know. Anyways, it's a metal box about 15 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 8 feet tall. To gain access to this van, you have to, this is another crazy one, and this is for normal everyday functions. This isn't regarding his PPD stuff. You have to get inside one of these vans, because there's like a whole row of them, almost like a trailer park kind of. You have to contact the front gate to gain access to it. Then you have 10 minutes to actually get inside the van. You have to enter a password to open the door, which would change every single week. And if there was any break in progress there, or the alarms would go off and you get in tons of fucking trouble. But as he starts to learn his new job and mentally halfway preparing himself for the communications, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he receives his first transmission from the ETs, right? So as he's entering the C van, so he's kind of getting into this van. And they describe the inside of these vans like there's so much communication tech in here that there's literally just enough room for two guys to sit down in their chairs. That's like they're back. I guess they're back to back, but that's like all the room they have. So as he's entering the C van, trying to get ready to do his normal job, he hears a message in his head that says, "Prepare for incoming string." And this just, startles him because he's never had anything like this happen before. So he audibly says, "Wait." And then he, at the same time, sends a mental one of the word "wait." But the partner inside the van is like, "What? What am I waiting for?" And Dan's like, "Oh, nothing. I'm just talking to myself. I apologize." And Dan just wasn't ready. He hadn't gotten to his computer, because like to get to the special screen to record his comms, like he had to sit down, he had to right click on the mouse, press F10, do all of this fancy shit just to pull up that menu bar. Interestingly enough, who or whatever is on the other end must have actually understood Dan saying "wait," because it didn't send anything until Dan ends up communicating like, "Hey, all right, we're good." Oddly enough, when communicating, he said they all of their comms between him and the Grays every scenario was exactly the same. They would send a 3-digit number first. This number was actually Dan's number, the 118. And then it would turn into another string of numbers that, for whatever reason, Dan refers to as the zip code, probably because it was a 5-digit string. And the numbers in that would always vary. And then from then on out, the comms would only be in numbers. And he gives an example here. This is exactly how he would write it on his screen that he's recording this information. It would go 118/555/004/00043/47477899/055/9400/. And the slashes in this sequence were pauses in the information that were given. He even said at times he could pick out things like latitude and longitude. And at this point, he's like, oh shit, dude, like, I want to look these up because I know these are latitude and longitude. I know they are. But he didn't have a map like readily available, and as you could tell, writing shit down is a big no-no. Yeah. We don't do that. So he's like, I don't want to risk it. I don't want to get in trouble. But as I'm sure you could sit and rationalize, like at first, the reality sits in that I'm fucking communicating with aliens right now. This is crazy. But as time goes on, you could also imagine how bored he gets, because it's literally just number strings that are coming to him. He has no idea what the information is. All he knows is that I'm communicating with something, and it's all numbers that I don't fucking understand anyways. So he kind of honestly loses all interest in it. And mostly because it's just a one-way conversation. It's whatever it is on the other line, sending numbers to him, and that's it. And he's just recording it. And so it just lost all of its luster with him. For a long while now, basically months after completing Dan's training classes, Dan hadn't had to take any of those pills we were talking about in the first episode. All of a sudden, Captain Stanley shows up, enters the C-van, and asked the new guy to take a hike for a minute. He starts talking to Dan. He's like, hey, man, I need you to start taking these again. Dan kind of like acts like a know-it-all. He's like, I know, take 2 a day. They don't leave the site, yada, yada. And Stanley's like, no, actually, you're only going to take 1. And he's like, oh, that's a little different, but all right, whatever. And it's also strange to me that, like, they played around with his dose, like, because they were making him take it for a while, then he stopped taking it, and then I would assume that because of the communication level, somehow they're monitoring him and knowing that he needs to take this again. You know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't make sense why all of a sudden they'd just be like, all right, we'll start taking these again, unless they can monitor him somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, which, I mean, essentially, if they knew they had the ability beforehand, they could probably keep track of how far he's advancing, right, or if he's falling behind, or...
Yeah, it's weird because it's like when you pay attention, they've closely monitored him so much his entire life that they know things down to this dosage, when he's waxing and waning and when he needs to take more. It's just it's crazy to see how vested they are in this process.
I wonder what happens if he were to have broke the protocol and they had to, like, eliminate him from the program.
I don't know.
Especially after he knows that he has the ability to do this if he can hone in on it.
I don't know. That's a good question. We might explore that later on in the third installment of this. Maybe not.
It just
But like when it comes to control, Stanley tells Dan, he's like, don't try to take them outside of here. You fucking leave them here. He's like, we will know if you haven't even taken one of these things. We'll know. So how? Because aside from taking the bottle from him every night or something, and watching him take those pills, how the fuck would they know if he slipped it in his pocket?
Yeah, it's almost
and said he took it.
It's almost like they have to be tapped into his brain.
So it has to be something, man. It has to be.
Because they already know, they're already monitoring everything about his brain anyway, getting him to like move these pinpoints with his mind, and they know that has the ability to essentially telepathically communicate with aliens. So it's almost like they are tuned into the human side of the ability of this thing.
They might be.
So it's weird. It's almost like our cell phones listening to us, like putting up things that we don't even say out loud, just things we think about.
Yeah, that's true.
It's probably so far advanced.
That's true.
That they were doing this beforehand,
right.
So they would know because in his brain he's thinking, I'm going to put one of these in my pocket. He doesn't have to say it.
Yeah.
You know, he may have thought that, and they're shutting him down beforehand.
It very well could have, because he at the time he does start asking questions about it, you know, like snooping around. And of course, he gets the runaround, but I don't know. That's a good point.
That sucks.
It does suck. It does suck. But the last 3 months during his deployment at the first base, a little bit less mundane for him. The gray that he'd been talking to for this whole time, he ends up nicknaming him Spock because of like the uniform way that Spock communicates with him. Like everything is very like set out and perfect. Like it's all uniform. Until one transmission caught his attention. It started out the same as always. And during his mental communication with Spock, Dan actually ends up messing up and accidentally transmitted another sound. And the best way that Dan can explain this, he equates this to using a reed in your mouth and making your normal noises when all of a sudden, like, you mess up and a loud screech comes out. That's kind of what Dan did mentally. Instantly, Spock meets Dan at this level and asks him if he intentionally switched planes. Dan goes, "No, I didn't even know this plane existed." To which Spock jumps off that plane immediately and cuts communication. So you're like, what the fuck? So, and like I said, Dan is a very curious person, and he plays this back and forth. He weighs it up and down. A few days later, another transmission comes in. It's all normal. And Dan's left wondering if Spock will bring it up about the plane switching. And he never does. He just kind of runs the communication as normal and then signs off. Well, now Dan is left in this suspense state where he's like, I kind of wish he would have called me on it because I want to know more about it. So he's like, well, I know what I can do. 2 weeks after the higher plane event, Dan had enough waiting and decided to go for it. Even more so since they always keep him in the dark with the project. Like, Dan will ask him questions and they're like, yeah, you don't need to know, so get the fuck out of here. We're not telling you. Yeah, Dan's kind of had it up to here with it, and he's like, well, I'm going to start getting answers on my own then. Fuck this. And Captain Stanley said, which also aids to Dan being so brave, he had been talking to Stanley, and Stanley told Dan that Dan was actually one of the first IC people that anyone has ever worked with. So he's in that first line of IC people coming to the front of the lines. So literally Stanley's like, so if it seems like we're flying by the seat of our pants, we are.
Yeah.
And so Dan's kind of like, well, all right, fuck it then. Nobody told me that I can't go to this higher plane, so I'm just going to start trying to go to this higher plane. Fuck, whatever. So as the normal comms were coming in, Dan knew the transmission was getting ready to come to its close, so he decides to go for it. Well, either he was too late in going for it, or Spock was like, nah, we're good. I'm not going to play it long, because nothing came back. So Dan's like, maybe I fucked it up, I'm going to keep trying. I got to try. And he did. He kept trying, but he just couldn't duplicate it. So he started to think it was just more or less a fluke. But the fact still remained that he was at one point, whether it was a fluke or not, he was actually able to achieve hitting this plane. So either Spock isn't playing into it, or Dan's messing the entire thing up. Finally, after 2 months of trying to hit this higher plane, Dan gets it. And immediately, Spock tunes in again and is like, did you do this on purpose? And Dan's like, yes. Spock responds with, well, this is an interesting turn of events. I ignored it the first time because I thought it may have been an anomaly. It makes me wonder, too, and this is me talking here, because we read it and understand what Dan and Spock are talking about. Like it's in this plain English dialect, right? But Dan mentions before, and I think this is like a net statement that I'm making here. But Dan mentions before that understanding on this level, when you're communicating intuitively, it's not how you and me communicate or understand things. Like there's a whole new level to this, and it kind of makes me feel like people refer to downloads and shit like that. It's almost like being plugged into the Matrix and learn to fly a helicopter. You have no actual memory of learning to fly a helicopter, but you just know how to do it. Like it turns into this muscle memory situation. I don't know. It's so hard to explain, but I feel like that's why these downloads and stuff always match said person's dialect, because the intuitive communication is on just such a different level, but it's also relating to the person receiving it.
Yeah. Like it's very experiencer specific.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a great way to put it. Like if it was talking to somebody from China, well, it would come in their language and their numerical layouts and that whole situation. Like that's how it would be.
Yeah.
Anyways, so Dan is jacked into this higher plane and he's kind of excited and he's like, all right, fuck it. I'm going to start prying. Like Spock's talking to me, so why not? So he asks, is this an unauthorized comm? Spock responds with, no, there's no harm in communicating on this plane. And he says it in a very nonchalant tone, which is kind of how I end up reading it. And I feel like the way that I perceived it was almost like a parent watching a kid explore the world on his own and just allowing things. Like you're looking and your kid does something and looks back at you like, is this okay?
Yeah.
And you're like,
am I good? Am I good?
Yeah. Go ahead, play around.
Yeah, I see that. I see that too, especially when like he drilled him at first. Like, did you mean to be here?
Right.
It's almost like he passed another test.
Almost.
And Spock's like, all right, let's see what he's got. Let's see what he can do here before we move on or move him back.
Right. So, with that being said, Dan asked Spock, why are you so candid on this plane, but in the other one you're so formal? Spock once again replies with, you've never given me reason. So Dan goes a little deeper and way off script. It's interesting to see where Dan's brain fucking goes when he's talking to aliens. Like he just goes, so do you have feelings like normal humans?
It's like he opened that door of communication and he just goes in.
Yeah.
It's like, yo, so
he's just start asking anything that comes to mind.
What'd you have for lunch?
So Spock responds with, we're quite alike in our emotional makeup, 118. We react to our surroundings just as you do, but are much less impacted by what we sense. In the absence of markedly increased stimuli, emotion is not readily useful. And I feel like that's a pretty interesting statement.
We talked about that before.
Yes.
We talked that it is our emotional, our feelings are our own worst enemy. Mm-hmm. Like our feelings get in the way of our rational thought. They get in the way of our preservation. And as we advance, those are probably going to go away.
I'm sure.
If we're going to be a species that survives. Think about how many people that put themselves in dangerous, life-threatening scenarios based on emotions.
Yes. Or just make piss poor decisions in general because you're mad or sad about something.
Makes perfect sense. That would be the
100%.
first thing that gets evolved away.
100%. Dan asks, why did you think it was unintentional when I first calmed you on this plane? This gets fucking interesting. Spock responds with, until now, we thought it impossible for a water human to sustain communication on this plane. But we are continually being surprised by other IC's ability as well. While this candid conversation was going on, Dan realized he wasn't logging this portion of the conversation and asked Spock if he should. Spock's like, no, that's not necessary. And their conversations are only being monitored through Dan's actual reports. So if Dan wanted to report on this, that's on Dan to do that, apparently.
It's weird that he says water humans.
Yes.
That gives rise to other humans.
Well, check this out. And it gets noted a little bit later, so I'll probably accidentally bring this up again, so forgive me. But Dan points out, and I'm not going to tell you what else comes of this, but Dan points out that that's the best way that he can describe it. Because once again, that intuitive learning is different to convey. And that's the best way that he can. He does use a couple other phrases that are very, very, very interesting. But I'm going to leave that there for now.
It's also interesting that he says there's other experiencers that are making the same, if not more, bounds than Dan is.
Exactly. Which means Dan's not the only one currently working with the Greys.
It's almost like, it's like they're superheroes.
It's weird, dude. It's definitely weird.
Because if you got people using it to the good, you know there's going to be people out there using it to the bad.
Right. I don't know. But at this point, Dan's kind of worried that he's going to get in trouble for communicating off the books on this new plane. Spock's like, I'm unaware of your people's standards, but we're good with communicating on this plane. It's interesting that we are able to communicate with water humans as it is, but being able to communicate on this plane really drives the interest up. Then all of a sudden, Spock just ends communication. And you can imagine, like, Dan's kind of perplexed because that's not how, like, normal people in they just, bloop, I'm gone, right?
Yeah.
So he's like, oh, shit. Like, and now it sets in that Dan's talking to fucking aliens, right? Because that was a legit conversation with an alien. So he's just sitting there after this like, what the fuck? So much so that his crewmate is like, hey, Dan, you all right, buddy? Because like Dan is just like completely zombied out, staring at the screen like, holy shit. I just had a conversation with a fucking alien.
Yeah. Could you imagine being just the chill dude in the other seat? Like, the fuck is happening? Like, what in the actual shit is
Dude.
going on with this guy? I'd probably just get out and leave. I'd be like,
Oh, yeah. This motherfucker's a weirdo.
Yeah, there's something very, very wrong going on here.
So the rest of the day, like I said, Dan's in this like zombified state, but he just like barrels through his duties as best as he can. Even after the shift, Dan just laid in bed, like wondering. Like it was almost like this level of little kid excitement. He's like, what should I ask next? What can I talk to him about? What can I figure out? He's like, I got to get more information out of Spock, dude. I have to. And so he starts to like line out these questions. Unfortunately, his next comms with Spock never came because they end up ending his time at this base. They put him in for a transfer. So the communication with Spock was done. Now Dan did hope that at his next base, at his next assignment, he hopes that Spock, and he hopes and assumes Spock is going to be the one that he talks to. Because he's like, well, maybe it's like, with the Captain White, like that's kind of like my dude now.
Yeah,
like
you already developed some rapport with him.
Like we're in it now.
He's not a dick.
Right.
You ain't got to worry about it.
And you kind of like Spock. Like Spock has this like, just like nonchalant demeanor about him. Like
once you break the ice, he's pretty chill.
Yeah, like he has when he does business, he does business. But when you're off the clock, he's a normal gray, I guess, as normal as they can get. Now I do circle back here. Dan notes on the water human part. He said, like I said, this is the closest that he could convey it. The understanding is slightly different when doing this intuitive communication shit. But he also explains how it could be translated a few separate ways. So you have the water human or water vessel or water entity. That's a little weirder to like wrap your brain around.
And these were all different.
No. So, okay, Spock. We'll just say that Spock calls you a cup.
Okay.
And I'm assuming that we don't actually have a vocabulary or word for cup.
Okay.
Right? But we do have, intuitively, we have a process of like being able to understand what their word cup means. That's kind of how I'm picturing it, right? Because Dan says that water human was just the best way that Dan chose to portray that information.
I gotcha.
But it could also be translated to water vessel, water entity.
It's weird that they're so focused on water.
Well, what's our body mostly made of?
Water.
And
you hear a lot of people talk about like there's so much metaphysical connection to water.
Bro, you remember all them phone calls we used to get?
Yeah.
From the lady that was obsessed with the water?
Yeah, they wanted us to go to the water factory.
I remember.
The water.
But it is weird because she would talk about how the water communicates with you and stuff. And I'm like, oh, like that's the first thing I thought of.
Yeah.
Whenever I read that.
That's weird.
But homie is talking to aliens at this point. An alien.
It says a lot that they like don't even. It's essentially like Spock doesn't even equate us to like a life form. We're just a water container.
That's not. I mean, I do see your point there.
Like the water is the most important aspect. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Strange.
Yeah, I feel like it was probably because we're mostly made up of water.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense.
Right. Now, I do know that information will change in the next episode, so I will leave that out because it does get a little more personal in the next episode, which I'm excited to get into because this one just kind of lays out the whole process, how it unfolds. I said, the way he writes it is very like factual. This is the way that it went. There's not a whole lot of gaps to fill in his words here. It's just like you're just kind of walking and living that story with him. Because I can understand a lot of the decisions that Dan made along the way, why he did and didn't do certain things. Like I can wrap my brain around a lot of that. I don't know that I would be as calm as Dan in like accepting the fact that I'm currently communicating with a gray. That would be weird, but it would also be interesting to perceive that type of information, because like if it came across in my head like Steve's voice, I don't think that I would be that, like, even if I didn't recognize your voice, I don't think that I would be as scared. You know what I mean? Like, 'cause you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
Like,
that's exactly, I mean, that would be exactly why they're making it experiencer specific.
yeah.
They're trying to make it as chill. It's just like screen memory. It's just like making it as non-threatening and non-anxiety inducing, I guess.
Yeah, or invasive.
Yeah, as possible.
Yeah.
It's weird.
It's so weird to think about, but it also makes me think about all these motherfuckers out there that talk about receiving downloads.
Dude,
and stuff like that.
How many people are out there that have this ability that don't check all the boxes, that the government's not interested in, that the entities are interested in, and are still sending information and passing information on?
Because you can tell by one of the last things Spock says that the fact that they are communicating on this higher plane is even more interesting. So now they're like, I wonder how far we like. It's this very scientific,
it's
feeling
strange.
there, and it's also like I know it's stupid, but it makes me think of your ham transmission we talked about and how all these numbers came over.
The same thing, bro.
Because a lot of people were lighting up the fact that they were talking in English and they were using numbers. Well, obviously, they're using numbers in these types of communications for whatever fucking reason.
Yeah, math's like a universal language across like every facet.
Which means no matter which way you look at it, that those numbers are translated somehow. Like to us.
Yeah. And that's
right.
like,
So there's going to be a cipher key or whatever you want to call it, a key to be able to understand what those number strings are.
Yes. And to touch on that point, I just got to say it since you brought it up. People lighting us up about like, why would they do it in English? They are broadcasting it to motherfucking Wyoming. Why wouldn't it be in English, dipshits? What are they going to do? Send it in ancient cuneiform fucking Sumerian symbols? Like, think with your brains. If you're going to talk to Americans, it would be in English.
It's a valid point.
They're advanced beings talking. Like, you're not going to go to the zoo and speak to a chimp in French.
That's true.
Like, get out of here.
And they are more or less superior beings that have been around for a very, 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 very long time. So they're going to kind of know how we operate at that point.
Yeah. They watched us forever.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll get into that in the next episode as well.
Let me try to get this message across, but I'm going to send it in an indecipherable,
dead language.
Or a language that you aren't even able to hear. It's just a frequency that human ears can't process.
Can't even get it.
Get out of here, you fucking nerds.
Yep, but that's where I'm going to end the conversation or end this episode.
Business is about to pick up.
Yeah, it gets a lot weirder
in wrestling terms.
It gets a lot weirder in the next episode. Like that's all strange. There's some pretty interesting information.
You had to like set the tone.
Yeah, because the next one Dan gets to explore a little bit more.
It's a lot to like. You almost have to take in all the tech stuff to be able to understand like how he's communicating.
Well, I kept some of that in there too because I feel like some people are gonna understand it, or it might ring a bell in their head that it's not 100% ringing in mine. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So that way we can share. Because I do feel like some of that is extremely relevant in some people's research, and maybe we can cross communicate there, and or maybe it's just in the end it'll just help you and make sense to you.
I dig it.
There was a lot of information, a lot of processes, but the next one, there are some questions that get answered. Dan finds out some pretty dark shit that he doesn't like.
That's not dope.
No. And I think the next one's going to be interesting because there's going to be a lot of questions and a lot of conversation.
Hell yeah. But until you are going to have to wait till next week to experience it, Holo Cult. Again, I don't even need to say it by now. Don't listen to next week's episode until you've listened to this week's. But since you're at the end of the show, you've already listened to it. Check us out at all our socials: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, Discord, Reddit. Be sure to share this episode. Till we meet again, stay safe, stay weird. And any of you experiencing water vessels out there that feel like they may be in contact with these, let us know.